Picture this. It's the 8th of August, 1588. You're standing on the deck of an English pinnace somewhere in the cold, gray waters of the English Channel, and the world smells like gunpowder, salt, and burning wood. The sky above you is the color of a bruise, dark purple at the edges, fading into the pale morning light of an English dawn. The sea is choppy. Your boots are soaked through. You haven't slept in 3 days. And then you hear it. A sound unlike anything the world has produced in this century. 130 Spanish warships, the most powerful naval force ever assembled in the history of Western civilization. Their guns have been firing for so long that the thunder of their broadsides has become the background noise of your life. You no longer flinch at it. You've been chased up and down this channel for over a week. You've watched men die. You've watched ships burn. You've run low on powder, low on shot, low on food, and terrifyingly, dangerously low on hope. But something is different today. Today, the Spanish Armada is trapped. Today, the greatest fleet Europe has ever launched is cornered against sandbanks near the Flemish coast, disorganized, panicked, its legendary crescent formation broken for the first time since it left Lisbon 4 months ago. And today, you are no longer running. Think about that moment. Put yourself there. You are a sailor, a gunner, a captain in the English fleet. You have been outgunned, outnumbered on paper, and completely outmatched in terms of raw tonnage. The Spanish galleons looming out of the morning mist are floating fortresses, some of them taller than 3-story buildings, bristling with bronze cannons, manned by veterans of a dozen campaigns. The Spanish Empire at its height controls more of the world's surface than any power in history. Their soldiers have conquered the Americas. Their admirals have crushed Ottoman fleets at Lepanto. Their king, Philip II, sits in the Escorial Palace outside Madrid and genuinely, deeply, piously believes that God has ordained this moment, that God has looked down from heaven and said, England must fall. And yet, here you are, still floating, still fighting. And in a matter of hours, you are going to witness something so decisive, so catastrophically one-sided, that it will echo down through 4 centuries of history and change the balance of power in Europe forever. How did we get here? So how did a small island nation with a second-rate navy and a queen, that half of Europe considered illegitimate, manage to destroy the most powerful armada ever assembled? And what does this battle tell us? Not just about 1588, but about the nature of strategy, overconfidence, and the terrifying gap between a plan that looks perfect on paper and the brutal, chaotic, unforgiving reality of actual war? That's what we're going to explore today. And I promise you, if you stay with me for this entire story, you will walk away understanding not just what happened at Gravelines, but why it happened in a way that most history books completely miss. Before we dive in, if you're new here and you love stories like this, hit that subscribe button right now. Drop a comment below telling me where in the world you're watching from. I read every single one of those comments. And if this video hits the way I think it will, smash that like button. It genuinely helps this story reach people who need to hear it. This is history that deserves an audience. Now, let's go back. Let me be completely clear about something before we go any further, because I need you to understand the full weight of what we're talking about. This is not just a naval battle. This is not just England versus Spain, Protestant versus Catholic, Drake versus Medina Sidonia. This is a moment where the entire trajectory of Western civilization hangs in the balance. And that is not hyperbole. That is not dramatic YouTube phrasing designed to make you feel things. That is the cold, historical truth. Think about what the world looks like in 1588. The Spanish Empire is, without any serious competition, to the dominant superpower on Earth. Philip II controls Spain, Portugal, the southern Netherlands, most of Italy, enormous swaths of Africa, and, most importantly, virtually the entire Western Hemisphere. The gold and silver flowing from the mines of Peru and Mexico into Spanish coffers every year dwarfs the GDP of every other European nation combined. His military, the Spanish tercios, are the most feared infantry in the world. They've never been beaten in open field battle in over 100 years. His navy has more ships, heavier guns, and more experienced sailors than any other fleet on Earth. England, by contrast, is a small, cold, perpetually damp island nation with a population of roughly 4 million people, a navy that has never won a major fleet engagement against a first-rate European power, and a Protestant queen who has been excommunicated by the Pope. Catholic Europe doesn't just dislike Elizabeth I. The Pope has issued a papal bull declaring her a heretic and inviting any good Catholic to assassinate her without sin. Let that sink in for a moment. The spiritual leader of half of Western civilization has essentially put out a religious contract on the English Queen. If the Spanish Armada succeeds, if those 130 ships manage to escort a Spanish army of 30,000 veterans from Flanders across the Channel and land them on English soil, England falls. There is no question about this. The English army is a joke by Spanish standards. London would be taken within weeks. Elizabeth would be captured or killed. England would be returned to Catholic rule. And the entire Protestant experiment, the Reformation, the idea that individuals could read the Bible for themselves, that kings could govern without papal sanction, that the religious monopoly of Rome could be broken, all of it dies with her. And then it gets bigger, because a Catholic England plus a Spanish empire that already controls the Netherlands means that France is encircled. The Dutch Republic, barely fighting for its independence, loses its most important Protestant ally. The Protestant princes of Germany, already under pressure, lose the ideological credibility of having a Protestant superpower survive. The Reformation, not just in England, but across Northern Europe, begins to roll back. The Americas, colonized by a world with a surviving English Protestant tradition, would look completely different. The political philosophy, the religious tolerance, the mercantile culture that eventually produces the United States of America, all of it traces back in ways historians have mapped in extraordinary detail to the survival of Protestant England in 1588. That is what rides on this battle. Not just an island, not just a queen, the entire shape of the modern world. So when those English fireships go in the night of August 7th, and when the guns open up at Gravelines on the morning of August 8th, you need to understand that the men pulling those triggers and cutting those fuses are not just fighting for their country. They are, unknowingly, gloriously, terrifyingly, fighting for the future. To understand Gravelines, we need to go back. Not just to the beginning of the Armada's voyage, but further, back to the decision that made this entire catastrophe inevitable. It starts with a marriage, or rather, a marriage that ended. Philip II of Spain had been married to Mary I of England, Bloody Mary, as Protestant history would remember her, from 1554 until her death in 1558. That marriage gave Philip a direct stake in English politics, a connection to the English throne, and most importantly, a co-monarch's legal claim over England itself. When Mary died childless, the crown passed to her Protestant half-sister Elizabeth, and Philip lost all of that overnight. He did not take it well. Philip spent the next 30 years trying to manage Elizabeth, undermine Elizabeth, and eventually destroy Elizabeth through every means short of open war. He supported Catholic plots against her. He funded Irish rebellions, He quietly backed every conspiracy hatched by English Catholic exiles on the continent. Say his patience, and Philip II was, whatever else you might say about him, a man of extraordinary, almost inhuman patience, seemed bottomless. But then something broke it. In 1585, Elizabeth did something that Philip could not ignore, could not manage, could not absorb. She sent an English army under the Earl of Leicester to support the Dutch revolt against Spanish rule in the Netherlands. Open, direct, military intervention in what Philip considered his own territory. This was not a covert operation. This was not a plausible deniability situation. This was the English Queen, his former sister-in-law. This woman he'd once half-heartedly proposed to after Mary's death, openly declaring herself an enemy of Spanish power. And then, just to make absolutely certain there could be no going back, Francis Drake sailed to the Caribbean in 1585 and spent 3 months systematically looting and burning Spanish colonial ports. Santo Domingo, Cartagena, St. Augustine. Drake was not subtle. He was not a gentleman pirate engaging in civilized privateering. He was a weapon, and Elizabeth had pointed him at the Spanish Empire's most vulnerable points and pulled the trigger. Philip made his decision. England would be invaded. England would be conquered. England would be returned to the Catholic faith. And the instrument of God's will in this endeavor would be the greatest fleet the world had ever seen. The planning began in 1586. Philip's original admiral, the Marquis of Santa Cruz, a brilliant, experienced naval commander who had actually won major fleet engagements, submitted a plan for an armada of 556 vessels and 94,000 men. Philip, or ever the accountant of empire, considered this budget and quietly had a heart attack. He approved a scaled-back version. The plan, as it finally crystallized, was elegant in conception and catastrophically flawed in execution. The Armada, roughly 130 warships and armed merchant vessels, would sail from Lisbon up through the English Channel. It would not attempt a direct landing in England. That was too risky, too dependent on weather, too vulnerable to English coastal defenses. Instead, it would rendezvous at the mouth of the Thames estuary with the Duke of Parma, Alexander Farnese, the finest general in Europe, commanding 30,000 battle-hardened Spanish veterans in the Spanish Netherlands. Parma's army would cross the channel in flat-bottomed barges. The Armada would escort them, protecting the crossing against the English fleet. And then Parma's tercios would march on London. On paper, this plan was unbeatable. Parma's army was genuinely the finest fighting force on the planet. The Armada was the most powerful naval force ever assembled. Combined, they represented a military capability that England simply could not match. There was just one problem. Several problems, actually. And they were not small problems. The first was communication. Spain did not control any deep-water port in the Netherlands. The Dutch flyboats, shallow draft, highly maneuverable small warships, controlled the coastal waters and would never allow Parma's barges to safely reach the Armada without a harbor for the Armada to shelter in while the transfer took place. Philip knew this. He acknowledged this. He told himself God would provide. He moved on. The second was Parma himself. Alexander Farnese was a realist. He looked at his flat-bottomed barges, looked at the Dutch flyboats patrolling the coast, looked at the timing problem of coordinating with an armada sailing 2,000 miles away with no reliable communications, and privately concluded that this plan was a fantasy. He wrote letters to Philip explaining the fundamental logistical impossibility. Philip read the letters, nodded, and told him to do his best. Farnese, being Farnese, did exactly that. He prepared as well as humanly possible for a mission he privately believed was doomed. The third problem was Santa Cruz. The original admiral died in February 1588. Some say of exhaustion, Some say of the stress of trying to prepare this fleet on Philip's impossible timeline. He was replaced by Alonso Perez de Guzman, the Duke of Medina Sidonia. The Duke was an aristocrat of impeccable lineage, tremendous personal wealth, and absolutely no naval experience whatsoever. None. He had never commanded a fleet in battle. He had never even served on a warship. He was appointed because Philip trusted his loyalty, his administrative competence, and his social status. Medina Sidonia, to his enormous credit, immediately wrote to Philip explaining that he was completely unqualified and begging not to be given the command. Philip responded by telling him God would guide him. God, as it turned out, had other plans. Let me tell you what the Spanish Armada actually looked like, because the numbers alone don't capture it. It was the largest fleet ever assembled in the Atlantic Ocean. 130 ships, ranging from the massive galleons of the Portuguese squadron to armed merchant vessels to supply hulks to communication pinnaces. The total tonnage exceeded 57,000 tons, a figure that wouldn't be matched by a single military expedition for generations. The ships carried 2,431 guns, 8,000 sailors, and 18,000 soldiers. They carried enough provisions for 6 months. They carried horses for cavalry, siege equipment for capturing fortresses, printing presses for publishing proclamations of Spanish rule in the newly conquered territory. The flagship, the San Martin, was a warship of extraordinary power, a 1,000-ton galleon carrying 48 guns, manned by 500 men. Its hull painted in the red and gold of Spain, its great stern lantern burning like a signal fire that could be seen for miles across the water. Standing at its stern, on directing the fleet by signal flags and cannon shots, was Medina Sidonia. Competent, dutiful, desperately aware of his own limitations, terrified of failure, but committed to his king and his God. The Spanish tactical philosophy, developed over decades of naval warfare in the Mediterranean, was built around a single devastating concept: the boarding action. Spanish ships were designed not to sink enemy vessels, but to pull alongside them, throw grappling hooks across the gap, and then unleash floods of veteran soldiers across the rails to kill everything that moved. Once you were in a boarding action against a Spanish tercio soldier, a man who had spent his entire adult life training for this specific scenario, or wielding a combination of pike and musket and Toledo steel with a ferocity born of fanatical religious conviction, you were almost certainly dead. No crew in Europe, English included, could match Spanish infantry in hand-to-hand fighting. This was their weapon. This was their strength. Get close, grab hold, and kill. To achieve this, the Armada sailed in a specific formation, the famous crescent, or media luna. The most powerful warships on the flanks, curling forward like the horns of a bull, designed to envelop any enemy fleet that tried to attack and force them into the embrace of those waiting soldiers. The supply ships and the less powerful vessels in the center, protected by the fighting galleons on the wings. It was a formation that made the Armada look, from any angle, like a closing fist. And when it appeared off the Lizard in Cornwall on the 19th of July, 1588, it was magnificent in its terror. The English fleet at Plymouth, commanded by Lord Howard of Effingham, with Sir Francis Drake as his vice admiral, looked up and saw something that made men's bowels loosen. 130 ships, stretching across the horizon in a crescent 7 miles wide. The sound of their cannon salute, fired as they cleared the headland, a booming declaration of arrival, rolled across the water and the countryside like the voice of judgment. Drake, famously, was playing bowls on Plymouth Hoe when the news arrived. He finished his game. Whether this was genuine cool-headedness or brilliant theater designed to steady his men's nerves, no one knows. But the story, true or invented, tells you something important about the English response to this moment. They were not going to panic. They were not going to run. And they had a plan. It was just a very different kind of plan than the Spanish expected. England in 1588 is not the maritime superpower it will eventually become. But it is already something new and dangerous. A nation that has been forced, by geography and ambition and necessity, to develop a completely different theory of naval warfare. The English, unable to match Spain's wealth in soldiers and unable to fight a land battle against the tercios and survive, have spent the previous decade rethinking what a warship is for. Under the influence of men like John Hawkins, the treasurer of the Navy, the English fleet has been rebuilt from the keel up on a radical new principle. Forget boarding. Forget soldiers. And build ships that are lower, faster, more maneuverable, with their guns mounted to fire in broadsides, heavy bronze cannons positioned along the gun decks, able to pour shot into an enemy hull from a distance that keeps English sailors safely out of the reach of Spanish swords. The English ships, the Elizabeth Bonaventure, the Triumph, the Ark Royal, the Revenge, are smaller than the great Spanish galleons. But they can do something the Spanish ships cannot. They can sail closer to the wind, turn tighter, and maintain a killing distance of perhaps 100 to 300 yards, where their long-range culverins can pound an enemy hull without ever getting close enough for the enemy to board them. This is the theory. The question in July and August 1588 is whether it will actually work. The answer, for the first week of the campaign, I was not as well as they'd hoped. The English fleet spends the week of July 20th to July 29th pursuing the Spanish Armada up the channel, attacking the rear and flanks of the crescent, trying to break the formation, trying to cut out individual ships, trying to force the kind of decisive engagement that would cripple Spanish fighting power before they could rendezvous with Parma. And they discover something deeply frustrating. The crescent holds. The Spanish discipline. Whatever else you say about Medina Sidonia, he maintained extraordinary fleet discipline throughout this campaign. Keeps the formation together, even under sustained attack. The English guns are doing damage. Ships are being hit. Men are dying. Barrels of powder are exploding below decks. But the Spanish formation absorbs the punishment and keeps moving. And it keeps the pattern of mutual protection that prevents the English from isolating any single vessel long enough to destroy it. There are moments of crisis for the Spanish. The San Salvador blows up when a powder magazine catches fire, killing 200 men in an instant. The Rosario collides with another Spanish ship and is left behind, eventually captured by Drake in a piece of opportunism that will cause considerable controversy back in England. But these are wounds, not mortal blows. The Armada reaches Calais roads on August 6th, drops anchor, and sends word to Parma. We are here. Come out and meet us. And this is where the plan completely falls apart. Parma cannot come out. Not yet. Not today. His barges are not ready. His men need time to embark. The Dutch flyboats are patrolling the coast, are ready to massacre anything that tries to cross without naval protection. He needs, at minimum, days more of preparation. Possibly a week. Medina Sidonia, anchored in Calais roads, exposed to wind and tide, and an English fleet that is sitting just a few miles away watching him, does not have days. He knows this. The English know this. And on the evening of August 7th at midnight, Lord Howard of Effingham makes the decision that will define this entire campaign. He sends in the fireships. Imagine you are a Spanish sailor, lying in your hammock aboard a galleon at anchor in Calais roads on the night of August 7th, 1588. You have been at sea for months. You are exhausted, seasick, underfed, anxious. The English fleet is somewhere in the darkness behind you. Parma's army is somewhere on the coast ahead, and you are in between two uncertain things, dangling in a geographical and strategic limbo that nobody in the fleet actually enjoys, and you are trying to sleep. Then the alarm bells start. You scramble up onto the deck, and you see them. 8 ships, coming out of the darkness, moving with the tide and the wind, directly toward the anchorage. And they are on fire. Not on fire in a contained, accidental way. On fire in every possible sense. Their rigging burning like curtains of flame, their gun decks glowing orange and red. The fire racing up their masts so fast that by the time you've registered what you're seeing, those ships are pillars of burning light on the black water, moving, steady, unstoppable, aimed directly at you. The Spanish sailors knew fireships. They had feared fireships for years. The reputation of the fireship as a weapon was ancient and terrifying. But in recent memory, the horror of what the Spanish called the hell burners at Antwerp in 1585 had lodged itself in every experienced sailor's nightmares. At Antwerp, the Dutch engineer Giambelli had sent fireships packed with powder into the Spanish pontoon bridge. And when those ships exploded, the blast killed 800 men and threw bodies half a mile through the air. The sound was heard as far away as Ghent. The Spanish did not know that Howard's fireships were simple, just old vessels packed with brushwood, tar, and spent gunpowder, set alight and sent on their way. They did not know there were no Giambelli bombs hiding in those holds. All they knew was that 8 burning ships were bearing down on them in the darkness. And everything they had ever feared about fireships was screaming at them to cut their anchor cables and run. And that is exactly what they did. This is the psychological turning point. Not the battle itself, but this moment. Midnight, August 7th, 1588. When 130 ships of the most powerful fleet in the world collectively lost their nerve, cut their anchors, and fled in disorder into the darkness. Think about what an anchor cable represents. It is not just rope, it is not just iron. Cutting your anchor cable is an act of desperation because it means you are abandoning something you cannot easily replace. To re-anchor, you need a spare anchor, and many Spanish ships either had no spare or had inadequate ones. Once those cables are cut, those ships are at the mercy of the wind and tide, unable to hold position, unable to regroup easily, and unable to reform the crescent. The formation, that magnificent, disciplined crescent that had held together through a week of fighting, instantly dissolves into chaos. Ships scatter in every direction. Some collide with each other in the darkness. The great galleons, in their panic, drift toward the Flemish sandbanks, some of the most treacherous shoal water on the European coast. The current is pushing them east. The wind is pushing them east. And in the gray light of August 8th, as the sun comes up over the Netherlands, Medina Sidonia looks at what remains of his fleet and sees a disaster. He is northeast of Gravelines. His ships are scattered across miles of open water. The formation is gone. Many ships are dangerously close to the sandbanks. He has a handful of galleons clustered around the San Martin, are trying to hold together enough fighting power to make a stand. And bearing down on him, out of the morning light, is the entire English fleet. Howard has been waiting for exactly this. Let me walk you through what happens at Gravelines. Really walk you through it, because the tactical picture here is fascinating, and it explains everything about why the result was so one-sided. The Battle of Gravelines begins at approximately 9 in the morning on August 8th, 1588. It lasts for 8 hours. And in those 8 hours, it becomes the largest naval artillery engagement in the history of the world up to that point. The geography matters enormously. So picture this. You are looking at the coast of Flanders, modern Belgium, from above. The coast runs roughly northeast-southwest. The town of Gravelines sits on the coast, and offshore, extending for miles in a shallow, treacherous shelf, are the sandbanks that have killed ships and sailors for generations. These banks are visible at low tide as yellowish smears of sand just below the surface. Beautiful and deadly. The prevailing wind on August 8th is from the southwest, which means it is pushing everything, including the disorganized Spanish fleet, toward those banks. The Spanish are already in a terrible position even before a single shot is fired. Medina Sidonia, showing genuine courage that deserves acknowledgement even in the context of what is about to happen to him, gathers his squadron flagship galleons, the San Martin, the San Marcos, the San Felipe, the San Mateo, the San Juan de Sicilia, and turns to face the English. He's going to make a stand with the ships he can control, and buying time for the scattered remainder of the fleet to reorganize. The English approach in a completely different formation than anything the Spanish are used to facing. Instead of a crescent designed for envelopment, the English come in a line, ship after ship, overlapping arcs of fire, everyone staying at the optimal range for their long guns. The 4 English squadron commanders, Howard, Drake, Hawkins, and Frobisher, each bring their ships in close, but not too close. The key distance is about 100 yards, close enough for the English culverins to punch through Spanish oak, far enough that Spanish soldiers cannot throw grappling hooks. This sounds simple. It is actually a revolutionary tactical concept. Naval warfare, for thousands of years, had been about closing to point-blank range, and then fighting as though on land. What the English are doing at Gravelines, sustained, accurate, long-range gunnery from mobile ships that maintain their distance, is something between a new science and an art form that English gunners have been perfecting for years. And here is where English gunnery doctrine reveals its decisive advantage. English guns are mounted on 4-wheeled truck carriages that can be rolled back after firing, swabbed, reloaded, and rolled forward again. The English rate of fire is roughly 3 shots per hour per gun, significantly faster than the Spanish rate of fire, which is closer to 1 shot per hour. The Spanish guns, many of them mounted in fixed positions or on 2-wheeled carriages designed for land use, are slower to reload and harder to traverse. The mathematics of this becomes brutal very quickly. The English fleet carries approximately 1,500 guns. At 3 shots per hour, over 8 hours, that is 36,000 cannon shots raining into the Spanish ships. The Spanish fire back. They are not passive victims, but they fire slower, less accurately, and from ships that are disorganized, undermanned in terms of experienced gunners, and increasingly damaged. The Spanish hit English ships. Men die. Rigging is cut. There are moments when English captains take serious damage, but the English are hitting back harder, faster, and more accurately. Now add the terrain. The sandbanks of Flanders are getting closer with every passing hour. The wind and tide are pushing the scattered Spanish fleet toward them. Medina Sidonia is fighting on 2 fronts simultaneously, against the English guns from the northwest, and against the geography dragging him southeast toward destruction on the banks. He signals frantically for his ships to form up, to sail northwest away from the banks, to accept battle in open water, where they at least have room to maneuver. Most of his fleet cannot comply. They are too scattered, too damaged, too undermanned by the week of fighting that has already depleted their crews. Individual Spanish captains are making individual decisions, some heroic, some desperate, some simply wrong, without any coherent fleet-level coordination. The crescent, the great defensive formation that had been the Armada's strength, is gone. What remains is a collection of individual ships fighting individual battles, unsupported, surrounded, and being slowly destroyed. I imagine this from the perspective of a Spanish captain in one of the medium-sized galleons, the Nuestra Señora del Rosario, or something similar. A ship of 600 tons, 24 guns, 300 men. Your ship has taken hits along the waterline. You have carpenters below, literally hammering oakum and lead sheeting into holes in your hull, while the ship rocks and guns thunder around you. Your surgeon's cockpit below the waterline is overwhelmed. Wounded men lying in rows, screaming when the ship lurches. Some already dead, others praying. You have 2 English ships working in rotation on your starboard side, one firing while the other reloads. A coordinated pattern that means there is never a gap in the stream of iron coming through your planking. And to the south, you can see the sandbanks. You can see them because the sea is shallow enough that you can see the pale shadow of sand beneath the surface. And that shadow is getting larger. You are about to fight for your life and your ship on 2 fronts, and you are losing both. Think about that. Here is the element of Gravelines that military historians find most instructive and most devastating for the Spanish, which is the complete failure of Spanish planning to account for what the English fleet would actually do. Philip II's Armada plan was built on a fundamental assumption. The English would fight the same way the Spanish fought. They would try to close, board, and fight hand to hand. Given that assumption, the Spanish preparations made complete sense. Load the ships with soldiers. Train those soldiers relentlessly. Develop a formation that forces the enemy into your arms. Once they're in your arms, your tercios do the rest. But the English didn't close. They never got close enough to board. They maintained their distance with a discipline and seamanship that the Spanish found genuinely baffling. Spanish captains, in their reports and letters written during the campaign's early days, express a kind of frustrated bewilderment. The English will not fight. They circle like wolves. They dart in and out. They stay at distances where Spanish musketry cannot reach them, and Spanish soldiers are useless dead weight. And they pour cannonballs into Spanish holes with a methodical intensity that feels less like warfare and more like industrial destruction. Medina Sidonia, for all his inexperience, grasped this problem almost immediately. He wrote to Philip during the Channel Passage that the English tactics were unlike anything in Spanish naval experience, and that his ships were being damaged faster than he could repair them, without any opportunity to force a decisive engagement. He asked for urgent advice. Philip, in his palace outside Madrid, surrounded by courtiers and maps, and absolute certainty of God's favor, did not provide useful tactical guidance. He told Medina Sidonia to proceed as planned, so the plan proceeded. And the trap, the real trap, was not the fireships on August 7th, though they were its trigger. The real trap was a plan that was incoherent from the start, assembled from mismatched assumptions, dependent on coordination across 2,000 miles of ocean without reliable communications, or requiring simultaneous, perfect execution by 2 forces, the Armada and Parma's army, who could not actually communicate in real time, against an enemy who had correctly identified Spanish tactical doctrine and developed a specific counter for it. The overconfidence was Philip's, not military overconfidence. Philip was not a stupid man, but something deeper and more dangerous. It was theological overconfidence. Philip genuinely believed that God had ordained this enterprise. He wrote in his letters that he trusted in God's providence to resolve the logistical contradictions in the plan. When advisors pointed out that the plan required Parma's army to embark and cross 30 miles of sea in flat-bottomed barges, while Dutch flyboats attacked them, barges that had no gun platforms, no protection against cannon fire, basically floating coffins, Philip acknowledged the concern and trusted in God. God, it must be said, was not cooperating. And on the morning of August 8th, as the English fleet closed in on the scattered remnants of the greatest armada ever assembled, the full weight of that theological overconfidence came crushing down on 130 ships and 26,000 men. 8 in the morning, the English fleet is in position. Howard takes the Ark Royal directly at the San Martin, Drake in the Revenge drives at the southern cluster of Spanish galleons. Hawkins in the Victory and Frobisher in the Triumph work the northern flank. All 4 English squadrons attack simultaneously, a coordinated assault designed to prevent any portion of the Spanish fleet from concentrating against any single English force. The guns open up. The sound is beyond description. 150 English ships firing their broadsides in rotation creates a physical phenomenon. The air itself seems to compress. The sea surface shudders. Men's ears burst. Men's minds go blank with the sheer overwhelming violence of the noise. This is not the crack of muskets or the boom of individual cannons. This is artillery at industrial scale, sustained, rhythmic, relentless. The guns firing and reloading and firing again, in a cycle that seems mechanical rather than human. The San Martin takes it on the chin. Medina Sidonia's flagship is hit repeatedly. The Spanish accounts say she takes 200 hits over the course of the battle, though this number is probably an exaggeration. But she is hit hard, repeatedly. Her hull planking is punctured in dozens of places. Her upper works are shattered. Her rigging is cut and recut. When she bleeds men with every salvo, not in the dramatic, romantic way of novels and films, but in the grinding, biological way of actual cannon fire. A man standing near a hit is killed not by the ball itself, but by the wooden splinters it creates. Foot-long shards of oak traveling at lethal velocity, shredding muscle and bone with clinical efficiency. The screaming below decks is continuous. But the San Martin fights back. Medina Sidonia will not run. His flagship fires back at the Ark Royal with everything it has, and the Spanish gunnery is not without effect. The English ships are being hit too. The Ark Royal takes damage. Frobisher's Triumph is badly mauled in a separate action. English sailors die. English blood runs into English bilges. This is not a one-sided slaughter, at least not in the sense of the English being invulnerable. And what makes it one-sided is the mathematics of duration and rate. By noon, 4 hours into the battle, the English are running dangerously low on ammunition. This is a crisis that nearly saves the Armada. Howard has to order his fleet back to resupply from the storeships, and there is a gap of perhaps an hour or two when the Spanish fleet is not under active bombardment. But that gap comes too late to matter, because the damage is already done. The San Felipe is so badly damaged that she cannot stay afloat. She runs aground on the Flemish banks. Her crew fights to the last, but they cannot keep the sea out of her hull indefinitely, and eventually she settles into the sand, an enormous wounded animal dying in the shallows. The San Mateo, one of the most powerful galleons in the Armada, is a floating wreck by mid-afternoon. Her guns mostly silenced, her deck covered in dead and dying men, her captain wounded, her hull taking water faster than the pumps can handle it. She too runs aground. The Dutch warships, the flyboats that have been waiting just outside the action, close in and capture the survivors. The San Juan de Sicilia is so badly damaged that she barely manages to stay with the fleet. Others, less fortunate, simply disappear, sinking in the channel or drifting ashore on unfamiliar coasts, their fates unrecorded in any Spanish document because no one survived to record them. By the afternoon, the wind shifts. The Flemish banks, which have been threatening to consume what the English guns have left, are suddenly less of an immediate danger. The wind swings to the northwest, pushing the Spanish fleet away from the coast, out into the open North Sea. Medina Sidonia, still on his damaged flagship, still directing what remains of his fleet, makes the only rational decision left to him. He gives the order to run, not retreat, not tactical withdrawal. Run. Sail north, into the North Sea, around Scotland, around Ireland, and home. The Channel is behind them, the Channel they have traversed once already with such discipline and such hope. and which they will never traverse again. The rendezvous with Parma is over. The invasion of England is over. The enterprise of England, Philip's great divinely ordained project, is finished. The English fleet follows for 2 days, harassing the rear of the Spanish column, watching the formation that was never truly reformed stumble northward in disorder. Then Howard calls his ships back, not out of mercy, out of pragmatism. His ships are low on food, low on water, low on ammunition. His men are sick. Typhus and dysentery are running through the fleet. And besides, there is nothing more the English need to do. Nature will finish the job. What happens next is, in some ways, more terrible than the battle itself. The Spanish Armada, 130 ships, and the best part of 26,000 men, attempts to sail north around Scotland and west around Ireland to reach Spanish ports. This is a journey of nearly 3,000 miles through some of the most dangerous waters in the North Atlantic. They do it in late August and September, the beginning of the Atlantic storm season. They do it in ships that have been battered by a week of fighting, their hulls leaking, their crews exhausted, and their provisions running low because so many supply ships have been lost or separated. The storms find them. The first major storm hits off Scotland. Ships scatter. Some manage to shelter in Scottish ports, where they are at the mercy of local lords, some of whom help them, others of whom massacre their shipwrecked crews. The second storm, far worse, catches the fleet as it attempts to clear the west coast of Ireland. Ships that are already damaged and barely seaworthy are driven onto the Irish coast by screaming Atlantic gales. The rocks of Connaught and Munster shatter hull after hull. The losses are staggering. At least 33 ships are wrecked on the Irish coast alone. Thousands of men drown or are killed on the beaches. The English authorities in Ireland are executing Spanish survivors as enemy soldiers, and some Irish lords are calculating that English displeasure is worse than Spanish gratitude. Turn survivors over to English justice. Men who have survived cannon fire and storms find their throats cut on Irish beaches by sheriffs enforcing Elizabeth's war policy. The historical record of these killings is specific and detailed and deeply harrowing to read. When the survivors finally straggle into Spanish ports, Santander, San Sebastian, Ferrol, the reports tell a story of apocalyptic loss. Of 130 ships that left Lisbon, roughly 67 return. Of 26,000 men who sailed on the enterprise of England, approximately 10,000 survived to see Spanish soil again. Nearly 16,000 are dead, killed in action, drowned, executed, or dead of disease and starvation during the voyage home. It is, by any measure, one of the greatest military disasters in the history of early modern Europe. Philip II receives the news in his study at the Escorial. He does not rage. He does not weep. He sits with it quietly for a time, and then he writes, in his careful, precise hand, "I sent the Armada against men, not against winds and waves." He immediately begins planning a second Armada. This tells you something important about Philip. He was not broken by this. Spain was not broken by this. There were second and third Armadas, both wrecked by storms before they could engage the English, but proof that Spanish power was not destroyed at Gravelines. Spain remained the dominant European power for another generation. The English spent the 1590s fighting an expensive naval war that nearly bankrupted Elizabeth's government. But something had changed among the myth, the assumption, shared by Catholic Europe, that Spanish power was divinely ordained and ultimately unstoppable, died in the waters off Gravelines and on the rocks of Ireland. Smaller nations, previously cowed into submission, had watched the most powerful fleet in the world broken by a second-rate island navy and then finished off by the weather. If Spain could bleed at sea, then the monopoly was not absolute. If the Armada could fail, then Philip's religious empire was not inevitable. The Dutch, emboldened, fought on. They eventually won their independence, a republic carved from the greatest empire in the world through sheer stubbornness. The French Protestants, the Huguenots, took heart. Protestant princes in Germany, who had been quietly contemplating accommodation with Habsburg power, found their courage. And in England, something crystallized that would shape the next 3 centuries of British history. The idea that English destiny was maritime, that the sea was England's natural territory, and that naval power was the foundation of national survival. Elizabeth's speech at Tilbury, delivered on August 9th, the day after Gravelines, to her assembled troops who were still expecting a Spanish invasion that would never come, captures this moment with the imperfect but genuine eloquence of a woman who understood her historical role. I know I have the body of a weak, feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England, too. Those words were not just theater, they were policy. They were a declaration that England's relationship with its own vulnerability had changed. That small could defeat large. That preparation and innovation and courage could overcome numbers and wealth and divine sanction. That the sea, which had always been England's greatest defensive barrier, could also be its greatest weapon. Let that sink in. I want to stay with Medina Sidonia for a moment before we close, because his story is one of the most human in this entire episode, and I think it deserves more than the dismissive treatment history usually gives it. He was a man who told the truth, who said, clearly and honestly, that he was unqualified, that the plan had fundamental problems, that the coordination with Parma was impossible as conceived. He was overruled by a king who substituted faith for strategy. So he executed a flawed plan with genuine professionalism and considerable personal courage, standing on his quarterdeck under English fire when lesser men would have gone below. He maintained fleet discipline through a week of fighting that broke lesser commanders. And then, when everything fell apart, he made the decision, the right decision, to save as many ships and men as he could by running rather than fighting to the last in a battle he could not win. He returned to Spain and immediately submitted a detailed, honest report of everything that had gone wrong. He blamed the plan. He blamed the logistical failures. He blamed the weather. He notably did not blame his captains or his sailors, who had, with some exceptions, fought bravely. Philip received this report and retained Medina Sidonia in his service. The Duke retired to his estates in Andalusia and lived until 1615, largely ignored by the history that needed a scapegoat for one of Spain's greatest disasters. History gave him that scapegoat role. It shouldn't have. The failure at Gravelines was not Medina Sidonia's failure. It was Philip's, a failure of strategic imagination, of political will to hear uncomfortable truths, of the fundamental delusion that God's favor is a substitute for logistical planning. But here is the thing that makes this story more than just a lesson in Spanish failure or English triumph. The English victory at Gravelines was not inevitable. It was the product of years of preparation. Hawkins rebuilding the fleet, English captains drilling their gunners, Elizabeth and her council making the difficult, expensive decision to invest in naval power when the treasury was already strained. It was the product of tactical innovation, the willingness to challenge centuries of naval doctrine and develop a completely new theory of how ships should fight. It was the product of courage, the courage of men like Drake and Hawkins and Frobisher, who sailed toward that 7-mile-wide crescent without knowing whether their theory would work. And it was, finally, the product of a particular kind of clear-eyed realism, an ability to look at a stronger enemy, assess its weaknesses rather than its strengths, and build a strategy around those weaknesses. None of that sounds complicated when you say it out loud. Assess the enemy's weaknesses, build a strategy around what you actually have, not what you wish you had. Invest in preparation. But tell the truth about what is and is not possible. Listen to the experts. And yet these things, these simple, obvious things, are among the hardest things human beings and institutions and governments actually do, because doing them requires overcoming the seductive comfort of ideology, the pressure of ego, the fear of looking weak, and the deep human desire to believe that righteousness is the same thing as competence. Philip II was righteous. He was genuinely, profoundly, sincerely righteous. He believed with every fiber of his being that he was doing God's work. And he sent 26,000 men to their deaths because he confused righteousness with competence and faith with logistics. Elizabeth was also righteous in her own Protestant way. But she was also ruthlessly, brilliantly practical. She invested in her navy when it was hard, when she allowed her admirals to fight the war their way, not the way tradition dictated. She accepted the risk of innovation. And when the Armada was finally broken, she did not give credit to God, or not only to God. She minted a medal. The medal read, in Latin, Flavit Deus et dissipati sunt. God blew, and they were scattered. It's a beautiful inscription. And it's also a characteristically Elizabethan act of politics, giving God the credit in public, while privately knowing, as every one of her sailors knew, that God had help. So here we are, 430 years later, on the other side of everything the Battle of Gravelines set in motion. The Protestant nations of Northern Europe survived. The Dutch Republic became a global trading empire. England became Britain. It became an empire of its own that shaped the modern world in ways both magnificent and terrible. The United States, product of English Protestant settlement, English common law, English parliamentary tradition, exists in the form it does because 130 Spanish ships failed to escort a Spanish army across 30 miles of water in August 1588. You cannot always see the pivot points when you're standing on them. The men pulling those cannon lanyards on the Revenge and the Ark Royal and the Victory didn't know they were changing history. They were cold, tired, scared, running low on powder, and trying to stay alive long enough to see their families again. History is mostly made by people trying to stay alive long enough to see their families again. But the choices they made, the choices their leaders made for them, the choices a queen made when she built a fleet instead of an army, the choices of men like Hawkins, who looked at centuries of naval doctrine and said there is a better way. Those choices ripple forward across the centuries and arrive here, in your life, in ways you cannot fully trace and will never entirely know. That is the weight of history, not the weight of kings and queens and admirals, though they matter. The weight of choices, the weight of preparation, the weight of being willing to hear uncomfortable truths and act on them, even when everything in your culture and your theology and your ego screams at you that you are already right. I think about that every time I sit down to tell one of these stories. What would we choose if we were there? But would we be the ones insisting God would provide when the logistics clearly wouldn't support the plan? Or would we be the ones, maybe not popular, maybe not powerful, maybe just quietly doing the work, rebuilding the fleet, training the gunners, telling the truth about what the plan required? I genuinely don't know my answer to that question. I'd like to believe I'd be the latter. History suggests I should be humble about that belief. Here's what I do know. These stories matter. Not because they're exciting, though they are, and not because they're dramatic, though they are that too. They matter because they are the record of human beings under extreme pressure, making choices that compound across time into the world we live in. And understanding those choices, really understanding them, makes us better at the ones we face. If you made it to the end of this video, genuinely, thank you. I put everything I have into these stories, and knowing that you stayed, that you were interested enough to follow this all the way to Gravelines, and around Ireland, and back to Spain, and forward to Tilbury. That means something to me. Drop a comment telling me what you think. Was this battle inevitable? Was Medina Sidonia the victim of Philip's arrogance? Or was there something he could have done differently? I want to hear what you think. If you're not subscribed yet, this is the moment. Not because of an algorithm, not because of numbers, but because if you enjoyed this story, there are dozens more waiting for you here. Battles, sieges, collapses, reversals, moments when everything changed because someone chose differently. That's what this channel is for. And the last thing I'll leave you with is this. The greatest fleets are not sunk by greater fleets. They are sunk by the gap between what they believe about themselves and what they actually are. Remember that. And I'll see you in the next one.